All right, we're going to look at how to solve a one-step equation when there's multiplying or dividing. So first, a little bit of vocabulary. So x is called our variable. It's a variable. Now, a variable is just a letter or symbol that stands for a number we don't know currently. And then anytime you have a number in front of the variable, it's called a coefficient. Good word to know, coefficient. Okay, so in this case, our coefficient is -3. Now, solving an equation, your main goal is to isolate your variable. So in this case, our variable is not isolated because it has a coefficient of -3. So we need that coefficient to go away. The way we can make it go away is making it 1. So to make a -3 1, we can multiply it by its reciprocal. The reciprocal of -3, or -3 over 1, would be 1 over -3. Now, because of the inverse property, we know that when you multiply reciprocals, it's going to equal 1. The reason is the -3's factor out with each other, and they both become 1's. Okay? So -3 over -3 is just 1. So all of this over here, the -3 over 1 times 1 over -3, ends up equaling our 1. That is the inverse property of multiplication. So inverse property of multiplication. All right, so that's 1. The x is still there. So our coefficient went from being -3 to 1. Now, you can't just magically do that to one side and leave the other side the same. Remember our equality property. Whatever I do over here, I also have to do over here. So if I multiply this side by 1 over -3, I also multiply this side by 1 over -3. So that's the equality property. You've got to do the same thing to both sides. If I do this over here, I've got to do this over here. Okay? So same thing on both sides. Ignore my rolling markers. So that's the equality. Keep everything balanced. All right, so once I do this over here, I need to figure out what all this is. So I have two negatives. Those are going to cancel out. Then I have 20 over 3. There's nothing I can factor out, so I'm just going to leave it as 20 over 3. You could make it a mixed number if you want, and you can make it a decimal if you want, but if you don't have to, you might as well leave it as 20 over 3. Easiest thing you could do. So pretty much we're at our answer because 1x is really just the same thing as x. So x equals 20 over 3. We know that 1x is the same as x because of the identity property. These two things are the same thing because anytime you multiply something by 1, it's just that number, in this case x. So that's the identity property of multiplication. Okay? So to go through our steps, we need to isolate our variable, which means our coefficient needs to become 1. Okay? To make our coefficient 1, we multiply it by its reciprocal. -3 over 1, the reciprocal is 1 over -3. The reason we chose the reciprocal is because the inverse property says that will equal 1, our goal. Got to do the same thing to both sides, the equality property, figure out what that equals, and that is our x, because 1x is the same thing as just x. We've isolated our variable. So that's the identity property of multiplication. So again, like the other one with adding, you don't have to show this step with the 1x. It's understood that it becomes 1. So if I were just going to do this problem, how you all should be showing your work over here, there's the problem. You should show that you're multiplying by the reciprocal. If you like to add the over 1 part, you can. You don't have to. You can show that those are both going to become 1's. So since all of this over here is 1, that leaves x by itself, isolated. Show that you did the same thing on this side. Do out any math you need to do over there, and show that you got 20 over 3. So these are the steps over here that you have to be showing. You have to show that you're multiplying both sides by the reciprocal of the coefficient, and then the x equals 20 over 3. All right, so let's practice another one. So this time our coefficient is 2/5. So there's our coefficient. Remember, we want our coefficient to equal 1. That will isolate our variable of w. So to make it 1, we multiply by the reciprocal of the coefficient. The reciprocal of 2/5 is 5 over 2. So the 5's will cancel out to 1's, the 2's will factor out to 1, and I'm left with just 1 W. Now I have to balance out my equation, so I have to do the same thing to the other side, 5 over 2. A common mistake is people will do 2/5 over here, so really pay attention to what you're doing to both sides. What I'm doing to both sides, ignore that. What I'm doing to both sides is 5 over 2. So I need to go ahead and simplify it down. So I can factor out a 2, make that 22. So at this point, all I have left is 22 times 5. Now, anytime you have to do some calculation like that, just do it off to the side. I don't really need to see that multiplication. You can even do it on scratch paper if you like. Just go ahead and figure out what that is, and then come back to showing your steps and showing that equals 110. Okay? When I say show your steps, this is what I mean. I don't need to see your little calculations or anything like that. That can be off to the side, out of the way, or on a separate sheet of paper. All right, let's try another one. So this time we have x over -8 equals -3. Now, there's two ways to think about this. Really, this is the same thing as, put it over here to the side, that. Okay, so if you want to rewrite it like that, you can. You don't have to. Okay, you could just think about it as, I want to get rid of that -8, so I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. The reciprocal will put the -8 in the top. Now, the common mistake is a lot of people put an x in the denominator. If I put an x down there, what's going to happen to these x? They're going to factor out and the x goes away. I don't want the x to go away. I want to keep the x so I can isolate it. So what number is not going to cancel out or factor out with the x or cause any other problems is 1. Okay? Just like over here. This is a little clearer that I would do -8 over 1. So up to you. If you want to rewrite your problem like this down here, that's fine. Or if you can just go ahead and work with it like that, that's fine too, either way. But regardless, we're multiplying by -8 over 1. Because that will factor out these -8s, make them 1. And you see now everything is a 1 with the x, so x is isolated. Okay, same over here. Everything's isolated to just an x. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, multiply by a -8. If it's all over 1, really I'm just doing 8 times 3. The negatives will cancel out. 8 times 3 is 24. So my answer is 24, no matter which way you do it. So it's up to you. If you are okay working with it like this, that's fine. Otherwise, you can rewrite it like this, so it's a fraction coefficient. The main point is make sure your denominator is 1, because that 1 will help isolate that x. Do not make it an x, because that would factor out that x and make it go away on this side. All right, let's look at another one. So I have x divided by 3. Now, to make this easier to solve, I'm going to rewrite this how the last one looked. I'm going to write it as x over 3. Because remember, x divided by 3 is the same thing as x over 3. That means x divided by 3. I'm just rewriting the problem to make it a little clearer. If you really want, you could also write this as a third x like we did on the last one, up to you. But now if I'm going to solve this, I'm going to multiply it by 3 over 1. So that way the 3's factor out, and I'm left with only 1's with my x, meaning it's isolated. I have to do the same thing to the other side, equality property. And again, that leaves me with just -45 times 3. I know my answer will be negative, so I go ahead and write that down. You don't want to forget your negatives, that's a common mistake. Now I need to figure out 45 times 3. Again, when you're doing a little calculation, just do it off to the side. I don't need to see that part. Get your answer and bring it back into your steps. These are the steps that are important to show me. So my answer is -135. All right, here's our last one. It's an inequality, but the steps are exactly the same. So I have a coefficient of 21. There's my coefficient. I want my coefficient to be 1, so I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of 21 is 1 over 21. So that will factor out my 21's, leaving just a b times 1, which is b. You keep the same symbol that you had, so it was a greater than or equal to, so I'm going to keep the greater than or equal to. I need to do the same thing over here, 1 over 21. So now I'm looking to see if I can simplify this at all. and I have a common factor of 3. See that? 18 divided by 3 is 6. 21 divided by 3 is 7. So that leaves me with a fraction of 6/7. If you really wanted to, you could divide that and make it into a decimal. It's not going to be a pretty decimal. So I would really recommend just going ahead and leaving that as a fraction. There's really no reason not to leave that as a fraction. So just to recap, our main goal is to make that coefficient 1. That's what we did on all of them. And to do that, we multiply by the reciprocal, because that's the inverse property of multiplication. Here's our inverse property of multiplication right here. So our inverse property makes the coefficient 1, which by the identity property means it's just b. And then I had to make sure I used the equality property to balance out my equation or inequality. So if I multiply that side by 1/21, I need to multiply that side by 1/21. So those are the properties I'm using in this. And that's how you solve an equation with multiplying or dividing.